There are plenty cool, inhumanly durable, and definitely insane apostle designs in Berserk. Locus's metal centaur jumps out immediately. Irvine's wolf stag tor thingy is compelling. Borkov is a murder turtle, and you already know about the main man Zod, who got the most iconic horns in the entire series. But there is only one apostle in Griffith's service that can test the namesake of the Black Swordsman's blade, and that is Grunbeld. A hulking behemoth of a man even before he became an apostle, the Flame Dragon Knight has a life story that is as tragic as it is terrifying. Most of it was documented in the only Berserk spin-off title called Berserk, the Flame Dragon Knight, which a lot of Berserk fans consider to be non-canon, but for the sake of this video, we'll treat it as part of the overall Berserk verse because trust us when we say it's all relevant, man. The Dragon Slayer, despite being created for the explicit purpose of butchering dragons, has never actually killed one despite being used by Guts for over 2 years. Except that one time it came really close, and we're gonna talk about all of it. This is Grunbeld's anatomy explored. But first, a small PSA on Grunbeld and his backstory. Well, it's true that the thing that pulls us strugglers towards apostles is their crazy designs. What makes us stick with them are their backstories, or rather a lack thereof. We only get to know about the human lives of a grand total of 3 apostles throughout the series, and none of them are alive at this point in the manga. These 3 would be the Slug Count, Rosine, and the Egg of the Perfect World. All 3 of them were crucial to moving along the plot, and we think that's why Miura told us so much about them. The Count was our introduction to Apostle 101, where we learned how apostles are made in the first place and why. This was during the Black Swordsman arc, and Guts grew considerably as a character in the Golden Age arc that preceded it immediately after. So to bridge the gap between the two, the Guts that existed pre-Golden Age and post-Eclipse, the Lost Children arc was necessary, which is where Rosine comes in. The Egg of the Perfect World was at the very center of the Conviction arc, and without him, Griffith doesn't even get incarnated into the physical world, so we don't need to explain why he was crucial to progressing the plot, but Grunbeld is a bit different. Yes, it's true that his first appearance during Warcry of the Wind Part 2 immediately established him as a force to be reckoned with, and the subsequent revelation that he once held off a Tudor invasion for a decade with just 3,000 soldiers was inspiring indeed. But we have only ever seen Grunbeld as an apostle, and that's the case with all of Griffith's current war demons. We don't know anything about them from their previous lives, save their reputations in certain cases, and Grunbeld is part of that exclusive class. The others are Locus and Rakshas, with Irvine and Zod being even bigger mysteries than those 3 combined. But the thing is, we do know a lot about Grunbeld's backstory, arguably even more than we do about the Count, Rosine, and the Egg-shaped Apostle, and that's thanks to the only spin-off title to ever come out of Berserk, Makoto Fukami's 2016 light novel Berserk, the Flame Dragon Knight. Fukami, who is also the director of the divisive 2016 Berserk anime, wrote a tale that chronicles Grunbeld's life from the moment of his birth to the point he gained his reputation overseas as a legendary defender. And while its canonicity is debatable, it does give us a good look into Grunbeld's anatomy as a human. Moreover, the illustrations that show Grunbeld growing into the apostle we know him as today that are littered across the light novel come from Miura himself, so at least the anatomical aspects of the novel can be considered canon. Now that we have all of that out of the way, just how inhuman was Grunbeld before he became one? The answer is very, and in a sort of tragic manner that is trademarked by the Berserk franchise. He was inhuman even before he became one. Grunbeld's anatomy as a human being. Grunbeld was born on a small northern island principality called the Duchy of Grant. It was a volcanic island with many dragon-themed myths and locations, including a place called the Fire Dragon's Lair, which would end up becoming Grunbeld's command center in his adult life. He was born to a declining noble family called House Alquist, or Archbeast, depending on which translation you're reading, and since birth, it was evident that Grunbeld was different, and that it was going to make his life even more difficult than his birth circumstances already made things for him. Grunbeld seems to be suffering from some form of gigantism, because he was always bigger than every kid he met growing up by well over a foot, and that was also why he was bullied so much as well. His father died before he even got to know him, and Grunbeld was raised by his strict, prideful mother, who raised him up to be a noble first and foremost, one who would seek a death worthy of a warrior instead of dying in vain like his father before him. As a result, Grunbeld grew up extremely isolated from things like friends and warmth, and he spent his formative years trying to live up to impossible expectations. He would usually be able to hold his own against his bullies thanks to his size and strength advantage that came to him inherently, but the easiest way to bring down a giant is to either cut their legs out from underneath them or overwhelm them with sheer numbers. And that's exactly what happened to Grunbeld one day in his adolescence. He was beaten to within an inch of his life by a gang of bullies who ended up abandoning him near a stream, thinking that he'd actually died. Grunbeld wasn't dead though. He had simply been knocked unconscious by the trauma of the beating he took, but he would have died had a little blind girl named Benedicte not shown up to save him from eventual demise. She directed Grunbeld towards a mysterious body of water, which she claimed was a healing pool, and sure enough, Grunbeld recovers from all of his injuries. He befriends the girl that called him a great fire dragon at the lowest point in his life, and leaves the forest to return home, not knowing she was the high priestess of Grant's faith, and that he had just exited an interstice. Grunbeld returns to a scene of horror though, as the Tudor Empire invades Grant shortly after this incident, and Grunbeld is taken prisoner by the Tudor forces. He spends several years in a conversion program that tried to make him more sympathetic to the Tudor cause by any means necessary. But all it did was turn Grunbeld into the physically imposing monster of a man we see him as today. Even though he was still in his teens when he was put in the conversion program, Grunbeld's strength outclassed many seasoned adult warriors, and he proved that time and again. At one point during his imprisonment, Grunbeld was forced to fight a man at least twice his age with far more combat experience than he. Grunbeld came out on top of that fight, and it turns out it was sweet revenge as well, for this was the same Tudor soldier that had violated and killed his mother the night of the invasion. Another time, Grunbeld and his newfound friends Sigurd and Edvard were made to fight a live tiger with nothing but sticks, torches, and a massive warhammer to protect themselves. The warhammer was so large that no normal human should have been able to wield it, but Grunbeld wasn't a normal human after all. As Edvard and Sigurd distracted the beast, he grabbed the warhammer, lifted it over his head, and brought it down on the tiger in a sickening blow that killed it instantly. Soon after, the Tudor facility was flooded by Grant soldiers on a rescue mission, and Grunbeld was taken back to his homeland as a veritable hero and a brilliant knightly prospect. But this Tiger Slayer's fate changed the very moment he achieved his strongest feat of strength pre-knighthood, because it was in the debris of this tiger's carcass that Grunbeld found a weird white stone shaped like an egg with a distorted face etched into it. He took the egg stone as a keepsake and fashioned it into a bracelet, unaware that this seemingly innocuous trophy was going to change his very life down the line. 14 years after being rescued from that Tudor fortress, Grunbeld has become one of the most formidable knights that the Duchy of Grant has to offer. His presumptive gigantism has made him massive. Standing well over 12 feet tall as an adult, Grunbeld easily towers over men on horseback when standing on his own 2 feet. His body weight is such that he needs to use a chariot drawn by 8 horses just to carry him to the front lines. Grunbeld was not a quick and lithe fighter like Griffith or Serpico. He was built like an ox, and he fought like one. The warhammer that used to be as long as he was now barely came up to his waist, and Grunbeld's use of it was far more devastating than any regular sword would have been in his hand. By himself, he is capable of reproducing Guts' 100-man Slayer stand multiple times over, and unlike Guts, who is the definition of peak human conditioning, Grunbeld owes it all to his abnormally large size. This is not to say that he wasn't a trained warrior, or warfare was all he lived for, but Grunbeld simply outclassed every opponent placed in front of him with his sheer strength. And when that was combined with his skill, he became an unstoppable force of nature. His biggest achievement as a human military commander was to stave off a Tudor invasion force of 20,000 soldiers with his Grunbeld brigade, which was less than a sixth of the size. In the Flame Dragon Night, Grunbeld fought this force with just 1,000 men by his side, and he personally took care of thousands himself by wading into the front lines like a mad giant. But that isn't even as impressive as the most impressive feat of Grunbeld's human life, which is a true testament to his freakish anatomy. And that's the fact that he literally tanked a cannonball. It happened when he realized that his friend Edvard had gone insane and betrayed him to the enemy, and now Edvard descended upon Grunbeld, who was all alone, with 10,000 men and 6 cannons. Grunbeld was already injured and carrying the blind and dying Benedicte with him when he was cornered. He would not die leaving her unprotected, so Grunbeld decided to make his last stand then and there. Edvard's forces shot him with a cannonball, and to everyone's shock, Grunbeld intercepted and tanked it with his his massive shield. For context, cannon fire travels at speeds so fast that they can penetrate ship hulls with a single hit when aimed correctly, and usually weighed anywhere between 200 to 350 pounds. The only way a human being can survive a cannonball shot in their direction is if they manage to get out of the way in enough time for only an extremity to be hit, like a finger or toe. But they'll have to kiss that finger or toe goodbye forever because there's no way it's staying attached to their bodies with that kind of mass and velocity behind the cannon fire. Grunbeld used his entire left arm to shield Benedicte, and it should have ripped his arm apart, but he sunk that first shot and defied physics in that moment. Then Edvard's men riddled him with cannon fire from 6 directions, and before long, his body was singed, bloodied, and missing a few bits. But somehow, Grunbeld was still alive, barely. He had done all this to protect the woman he considered to be among his closest friends. Yet at this moment, when he felt his life force slipping away, he felt it was all for nothing. Remember how we told you guys that his mother drilled into his head that he needed to die a warrior's death, and it was the only way he would gain his rightful place among his ancestors? Well, to Grunbeld, this moment wasn't it, and he wished that he could have prevented his lousy death. His despair at dying the way he was dying, and his desperate desire for life so he could continue his battle with those Tudor bastards, activated the behelit on his wrist and triggered an interstice. At first, Grunbeld thought he'd stumbled into a dragon's lair in a fever dream somehow, but then he heard 4 voices call out to him and promise him a never-ending fight that was even greater than anything he'd experienced before in his life. Void, Slan, Ubik, and Conrad showed up in front of Grunbeld and offered him a new life as a true dragon, where he would be locked in an internal conflict under the Falcon of Light, and the prospect of living and fighting again convinces Grunbeld to accept their proposal. He also gives up his friends as sacrifices without much hesitation because most of them were in their death throes already, and at least this way they could live on inside of him. Grunbeld sacrifices Sigurd, Benedicte, and Edvard, whom he still considered a friend despite all that had happened, and transformed into his namesake, a great flame-breathing dragon. He devoured Edvard first, then helped Sigurd and Benedicte find peace by setting their bodies ablaze, before going on to defeat every Tudor force and stronghold on his island duchy all by himself. This part of the story is the only part that can be considered to be canon because it lines up with what Mule knows of Grunbeld, and how most apostles find Griffith after his incarnation. The first new apostle to show up after Griffith attacked Shet was Locus, who claimed that an oracle had led him to the Falcon of Light. The same thing happens with Grunbeld. Before his death, Benedicte, who is the high priestess of Grant and a seer besides, told him to keep living and find the Falcon of Light to serve under him, which is what Grunbeld is currently doing. But now that we've given you an idea about just how crazy he was as a man, we'll switch over to talking about the utter madness that is his existence as an apostle, because Grunbeld is, without a shadow of a doubt, amongst Griffith's top 3 strongest apostles. And a lot of that comes down to his anatomy, so let's get into that now, shall we? The flame-breathing dragon with near indestructible skin. Grunbeld's anatomy as an apostle of the Falcon of Light. Let's start off with his base form because a lot of changes do take place in Grunbeld's regular anatomy as a living entity once he accepts the Godhand's proposal. By now, you guys should know that when a human being becomes an apostle or even a pseudo-apostle, a fissure is opened up in their hearts, which links their souls to the abyss. This powers them with the essence of evil, while simultaneously ensuring that once they do die, there is nowhere for their souls to escape to but the abyss, which in turn further strengthens demonkind, and so the cycle keeps going. Grunbeld was always huge as a person. He was called the Flame Dragon Knight not just because his order was named so, but also because he had fiery red hair in his human life. As an apostle, he retained his red hair, but his eyes began complementing the hairdo because most apostles still have glowing red eyes even in their human forms. His mouth gained a set of fangs and his body somehow became even bigger, as he was now roughly 20 feet tall, all of it muscle and evil. But the first thing that gives away the fact that this is not the Grunbeld Archbeast from the Flame Dragon Knight is actually his armor and armament, because it somehow becomes even more personal whilst retaining the same overall theme from his previous one. In his human life, Grunbeld had a set of armor that the Mountain from Game of Thrones would have a hard time putting on, and it would probably also give Daemon Targaryen from House of the Dragon a fit for copying his style. Grunbeld's armor has always been dragon-themed, but the difference between the set he wore before his reincarnation and the one he wears now is in the details. Before his reincarnation, Grunbeld wore a suit of armor that was elaborate considering the circumstances of his birth, but befitting his station as a nobleman, and heavily detailed either way for armors set to be used in warfare. His body pieces were fairly plain, but the armor pieces around his neck were shaped like flames, with a heart sitting right underneath his Adam's apple. His greaves and gauntlets were also tinged by that flame motif, and his huge shield bore 6 blades and a dragon in flight emblazoned on its front. The most notable part of the whole attire was his war helm, which looks quite similar to the one that Daemon Targaryen wears in the House of the Dragon TV show, with a small dragon creeping up towards Grunbeld's brow. Following his rebirth as an apostle, Grunbeld retains the dragon theme for his new set of armor, but changes it up from the semblance of a fictionalized version of the creature to one he knew more intimately, himself. Grunbeld's new set of armor is shaped to resemble his true form as an apostle, and nowhere is this clearer than the helmet, which is basically a gaping version of Grunbeld's own head in his released state. He has also incorporated the cannon fire that took his life into his arsenal now, as his new shield doubles as a cannon and also resembles his mug in his released state, while the rest of the armor is far more elaborate and designed in accordance with his appearance as an apostle. But now that we've said that a few times, let's finally address what fundamentally changes within Grunbeld once he transforms. See, even in his base form, Grunbeld is easily top 3 in Griffith's new Band of the Falcon, without question. He was toying around with guts like the latter was a child, and could have punched out Flora's mansion if he wanted to, but he didn't because he's a man of honor and he was there to fulfill an ugly duty. That's all. Once Guts got his berserker armor on, Grunbeld was shocked by his newfound strength and speed, which allowed the Black Swordsman to shatter the Flame Dragon Knight's cannon shield and throw him way off his game. Grunbeld acknowledged Guts' insane potential as a fighter and decided that the time for an honorable fight had passed. He transformed into his release state and told Guts he was now going to do his duty as an apostle, and by God did it freak us out when that happened. You see, when apostles take their true forms, we expect them to look like grotesque H.R. Geiger paintings twisted further and brought to life, or like cryptids that fell into the hands of Mr. Floop. With Grunbeld, we get perhaps the most direct apostle design ever, and that's what makes his release state such a sight to behold, because he literally turns into a dragon. In this form, Grunbeld takes the shape of a more classical dragon, with 4 legs and no wings. While classical dragons did have wings, Grunbeld doesn't for practical reasons, those being that he stands well over 20 feet in height and weighs around 1.5 tons. And yet, every move he makes can easily kill any living thing in his vicinity, a fact that Grunbeld himself is well aware of. The reason behind Grunbeld's incredible weight is not just his massive size, but also the fact that his entire skin is made of corundum. Corundum is a naturally occurring mineral in our world, which is basically a crystallized form of aluminum oxide and often forms the basis for gemstones like rubies and sapphires. Corundum is also the 3rd hardest naturally occurring mineral in the world, which makes Grunbeld's skin literally too thick to bleed. Even in his berserker state with nothing to hold him back, Guts could only manage to crack Grunbeld's skin, and that too only because he attacked Grunbeld's face, which is presumably the weakest point on his entire body. This makes Grunbeld easily the most durable apostle we've seen till date, because even Zod, with all his immortal skills, needs to reattach his arm from time to time, like when he finds a worthy opponent or squares off against the Skull Knight for the umpteenth time. Grunbeld's size, weight, and endurance make him a near indestructible force on the field of battle, but what makes him live up to his own namesake as the Flame Dragon Apostle is the fact that he can breathe flames. In the light novel, we're told that after turning into an apostle, Grunbeld felt a strange warmth in his gut, and he breathed it out as one would do on a particularly cold winter's night. But instead of vapors appearing in front of his eyes, it was flames. Grunbeld's anatomy in his released state turns his default breathing into flame throwing, and that's about as hardcore as any apostle gets in the series. With his immense size and strength and flame breath, Grunbeld has helped Griffith take down hydras and reconstruct forgotten skywalks from 1,000 years ago, and it all comes down to his anatomy. Heck, the fact that he was able to withstand half the attacks that he ate from Dragonslayer tells you all you need to know about why he's the only guy that can make that sword earn its namesake. But we don't see that happening anytime soon, unless Guts figures out a way to deal with Grunbeld's corundum skin. You can deal with fire breath, you can evade a corundum-crusted tail whip, you can even jump out of the way of a vicious bite coming your way, but how do you kill something if you have to break your bones to put a scratch on it, which is what Guts did to Grunbeld. No other apostle has even come close to being at his level from a pure power perspective, and that's why Grunbeld is usually the one put in charge of keeping Griffith's war demons in line. They might get loose-lipped and less disciplined around people like Irvine or Sonya, but Grunbeld is feared and respected by all, not just for his spotless reputation, despite being an apostle, but also his freak strength as the Flame Dragon Apostle. We have a sneaking suspicion that he'll end up being the only dragon that Guts kills with Dragon Slayer in the entire series, but since the great roar of the astral world, we have a canyon full of those buggers just flying around and landing on castles and causing mass hysteria in general. Whether we get Guts versus Grunbeld 2 remains to be seen, because we don't even know if we will be getting the Guts we know in the next chapter of Berserk. After seeing his mind break under the stresses and struggles of his inhuman life, Guts seemed to have pretty much reached a final breaking point at the end of 373, and we're pretty sure that chapter 374 is going to open up with an exploration of that descent into full madness. Meanwhile, Griffith has gathered his top war demons, including Grunbeld of course, and told them that he desires to go to the east. The east has been referred to as an important yet mysterious site related to the secret of Behelitz, King Geiserik, the God Hand, and basically everything else in the story since the first arc when we saw Guts wonder how Slug Count's Behelit ended up in his possession from an eastern bazaar. Grunbeld has mostly been playing Apostle Keeper since Falconia was created, with the occasional Hydra fight here and there, but we suspect that whatever Griffith is planning next is going to involve him in a big way. And trust us when we say that his usefulness will not be born from his loyalty, as Grunbeld thinks. It will be because of the convenience his anatomy provides to Griffith's plans, because that's just the kind of man he is. Marvelous verdict. But as for this video, we're gonna have to sadly end it here. Grunbeld is one of the strongest characters introduced after what we consider to be the halfway point of the story, the end of the Conviction arc. And he's a rare case in that he's been able to hold on to that title since then. A lot of characters have shown up, are hot for a minute, and then get nerfed immediately after their arcs are over, but that's not true for Berserk, and Grunbeld, or rather his anatomy, is a shining example of this. But that's enough out of us. We want to know what you guys think. Did you like this anatomical breakdown of the Flame Dragon Knight? Do you want us to do more such videos on Berserk characters? If so, let us know which ones in the comments section down below along with your thoughts on this video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, keep struggling, strugglers.